Hello, everybody. It is Coding Clarity. I know it's been a little while since I've made another video. This is going to be my last video for a bit. I'm working through some different changes. It's currently getting into summertime and I'm trying to figure a lot of stuff out. So this is going to be a longer video than usual, but also a little bit of an ending of one section of videos until I start making more in the future. So growth of VoIP is this topic that I wanted to discuss today. And if you've never heard of the term VoIP, I'm going to explain that in a second. But the reason I chose this technology was because I've recently been seeing a huge influx of people using Zoom calls and people just talking to other people over the internet and doing voice, video, and all those kind of things, just because we're in this current era of social distancing. If you're listening to this in May right now as I'm recording it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So what is VoIP? So voice stands for Voice over Internet Protocol. It's the idea of me talking right now into a microphone, and what I'm saying is sent over. These voice data packets are sent from my IP address to somebody else's IP address. Now, this technology was originally created because international telephone charges at the time were super, super, super high. So if you wanted to talk to someone far away on a telephone, you'd be spending a lot of money. Now, that's kind of why VoIP was originally created in 1995. It was to basically push away from just the telephone charges and landline calls and do this idea of talking to someone else over the internet. Now, the internet was created in the mid-1960s, but for a while it was kind of a test project. It wasn't until the 1990s, specifically 1992, 1995, that most families started to actually get a computer and have internet working in their home. Now, this company called Vocaltech in 1995 created the internet phone, and their idea was, what if these two internet users could connect to each other and have the microphone and speakers set up so that they could speak to each other over the internet? Now, this was a new idea that no one else has really been using, and it had some downsides at the time. For example, there was no video because that would be super hard to do, sending that kind of amount of data over not the best internet at the time. It wasn't very strong, but as long as they both had the software open, internet phone, and they were on internet, that this was kind of what their service did. Now in 1996, a year later, voicemail applications started to be developed. So this was kind of the breaking point, but then people started being able to send messages with their voice over the internet to other people, yet it still wasn't great. The voice calls were often poor sound quality, had cut in, cuts out, and then also they would just randomly have periods of silence. This was all kind of like the beta test phase. It was a cool idea, but it didn't really have the efficiency to be used by a lot of people. But look at it, 2003, the number of VoIP calls was about 25% of all voice calls. Back at the start around here, maybe in 1996, 1997, it might have been 1%. But by 2003, it hit 25%. So the question is, why? Well, it also so happens that in 2003, Skype launched its beta software. And this software allowed people to not only do voice calls free of charge, but also messaging, which is a very important thing. You can send messages and you can talk. This was still a beta, but this was like huge at the time. This is part of the reason that this went up to 25%. We'll go into later on in a little bit, but if you look at 2005, Skype then started doing video calling, which at this point is when people were starting to really, really start jumping into VoIP. So Skype kind of was the one that really created this huge surge of people using VoIP because it was kind of a name that everyone knew. And they knew it was free and it was working really well and people were jumping in and it became this huge surge of people starting to use this. But starting in the 2000s, VoIP started becoming regulated because of its wide use. People were realizing that they couldn't do the long distance calls on telephones just because of the high prices. And they were realizing because internet was becoming more and more used, like I said before, mid 1990s, it was becoming widely used, but by the 2000s, uh, everyone basically had internet of some degree. So call services were starting to have issues because of all these different people using it. So there had to be some, the government had to jump in and kind of limit what was going on. But I think it's worth talking about when VoIP became mainstream. Like I said, 2003 was when it started coming into the picture. Um, and I think it's important to realize that the reason that it didn't really pick up until then was not only because of the poor sound quality and the advertisements before and after, but it was also the idea that landline phones in long distance really was the main issue. People didn't want to spend money to have a call. And with the internet coming in, Skype kind of jumped in and took what the main company we talked about earlier, it took what vocal text started in 1995 and basically made it mainstream. So VoIP today, um, I think it's important to realize that we have grown so much in technology over the last couple decades, and so obviously VoIP has as well. But I think it's important to realize that at the beginning, they didn't have Wi-Fi, they didn't have all these other devices like smartphones. It was kind of just the regular computers. But because of all these, this huge growth in technology, now you can do voice calls over the internet with any device to any other device. It doesn't have to be the same device. Businesses can do a little flat rate fee and basically can work away from telephones entirely and just do all their calls over the internet for maybe a little bit of money per month instead of having to pay per call. It's also really important because there are websites like this site that really just go into so much about VoIP, but also there are articles that say how to make free internet phone calls, some stats, cheap providers for small businesses. VoIP isn't just one or two names anymore. It is just a whole idea of talking over the internet. And I think that's really neat. So we've talked so much about why VoIP's good. What about some limitations? So there aren't a ton, but first and foremost, you need an internet connection, considering it is over the internet, you're sending packets. Quality of sound and video can be poor. So I said earlier that it was very poor starting out, but to do video calls, especially, but even just phone calls, just voice, you need to have a stable internet because it's consistently sending packets back and forth, back and forth. So that can be a real issue if your internet is jumping up and down, if you have a bunch of people running on the same internet, etc. It's not reliable during emergency situations. This was something I didn't really think about at first, but it makes a lot of sense. If you need to call 911 or you have an emergency, you should stick to landline or stick to a cell phone because your location is not really recorded or saved or known when you're calling on a computer or any other device using this internet system because it's through IP addresses, which aren't as easy to track as if you call with a cell phone or such. So it's important to realize it is important to have a cell phone if you're in an emergency so that people can know where you're immediately located. And it's not that secure. So if you've had any kind of technology classes, there's a lot of comments about how when IP networks are connected and sending packets back and forth, someone can jump in the middle. They call it a middleman attack. There's a couple other kind of attacks as well, where you can fake being someone and you can fake being on the other line a bunch of other ways. But these voice packets can be picked up and overheard if you're not in a secure connection. So if you're talking about something that needs to be kept hidden or secretive, or you really don't want information being leaked, be careful when using VoIP just for that reason. But that's just technology in general. You got to always be careful. Now, if we're talking about VoIP, I like this other acronym, SIP. It means Session Invitation Protocol. It began to take shape in the early 2000s, right around when Skype was getting in the mix, but also maybe a little before when the government started jumping in. It was used with VoIP as a means to initiate a conversation and start a group call. So this is a really interesting thing because I talked about security a second ago. This was helping you get more of a secure network so that everyone in the group call could all join in and be in the same little area. it's kind of the idea when you have Skype and you do those group conferencing calls. That's what SIP really is involved with. It also can be used on all devices, and it's usually supports that P2P or peer-to-peer capabilities. So VoIP and SIP together kind of made it the overall, you know, communication, like voice communication, easy, fast, reliable, and secure, just because it made creating groups and having these group calls way more private than they were before. Now I have a bunch of cool resources. I'll link these in the YouTube video, but then also they're on the website and you can find it there. I'll just link the website. Talks about Discord and TeamSpeak if you're into gaming. I also think it's kind of interesting when you look at the history, when you look at an article from 2005 talking about VoIP right after Skype got involved and what they thought it was going to be like in the future versus now. It's kind of cool to see the expectations that someone in 2005 had about technology and then looking 15 years later. I also go into some recommendations if you're trying to be in a business and use VoIP. Of course, there's a lot of free uses, Discord, Zoom, TeamSpeak, Skype, etc. But what if you want to have 90 plus people on a call? What if you need extra security, etc.? There's a couple recommended here, but there are so many and they all have different uses and different reasons. Some have a flat cost, some are really focused on making it easy to use so that anyone that uses this service has no issue getting around the UI, and some are more for small groups and they're trying to make it so that any cell phone or any device can easily connect. And I just think it's really interesting when we talk about the growth of something like a technology that started from one small company only about 2 decades, a little over 2 decades ago, and to see how it basically not only expanded a ton and became, you know, used on Skype and stuff, but this was only voice. Then instant messaging became with voice with Skype. Then Skype was like, what if we take this and start sending instead of voice packets? What if we sent, you know, pixels and pictures and all those things? And then it kind of took all of that together. So it's just kind of cool when you take a little aspect of technology that started out on the fringe and then to see it expand and expand as more and more companies jump in and see how something like this could be grown and adapted. Another really important thing to pay attention to is that all this company really did was took vocal samples, broke them down into voice packets, routed them to someone else, and decompressed the signal. And this was in the 1990s. But now VoIP is one of the most talked about technologies in the communications history. Its growth over the last few decades has been astounding. There's no telling where it could go from here, which I love that quote. But it's really true. We really don't know what would have happened if this technology didn't start out. And it's kind of crazy how one small company did one little project, figured out how to use, you know, connect voice. And then from there, it kind of just took up this whole revolution on the internet. I think that can be said for a lot of different little technologies back when internet first started becoming mainstream in the mid 1990s. But I think this is a really cool one to look at, especially now during this era where people kind of didn't really use video calling and all of that to such a huge degree until the demand went up. So I'm curious to see, maybe this software, I mean, this idea of sending voice packets is going to go somewhere further in the future when demand needs it. But it's kind of neat how something like this that started out in the mid 1990s was never as necessary or needed. But now in the, you know, in this new decade, we are having classroom calls, having voice calls every day with teachers and professors, doing homework and assignments and tests over the internet. And yet, thanks to this little company in 1995, we can do this. So yeah, I just think this is a really cool topic. It's really relevant. And I hope you guys enjoyed listening and enjoyed and maybe learned something new. So yeah, have a good rest of your day.